Hello and welcome to SilverGryphon Makes a Thing, where we make whatever we feel like at the moment. Today I'm kicking off a very special series that I'm affectionately calling Monster Hunter High, where I will be using the fantastic creatures featured in the Monster Hunter video games produced by Capcom as an inspiration for some really fun and unique dolls. On the surface, the Monster Hunter games are straightforward enough. You play a member of the Hunters Guild in a post-apocalyptic society and hunt dangerous monsters. Then you take those monsters and you turn them into weapons and armor in order to hunt increasingly more varied and badass monsters. But go a little deeper than that, and you'll find intriguing storylines, subtle world building, and dozens of complex mechanics that expand your ability to take on challenges ranging from electric unicorns to dragons with literal volcanoes on their backs to actually Jormungandr the World Serpent, and just about everything in between. I've been playing Monster Hunter for about 5 or 6 years now, starting back with Monster Hunter 3U. Like most people, I ran into some initial difficulty with the mechanics and finding a weapon that suited me, so I put it down. Then came Monster Hunter 4U and the Insect Glaive, and I fell in love. Apparently all I needed in life was the ability to pole vault around a giant monster while beating it about the head and shoulders with a stick and a big bug buddy. I've been playing ever since. One of the things I love most about the series is the thought and detail the creators put into each and every monster. With such an outstanding array of monsters for inspiration, I found myself itching to use them as a basis for a series of dolls, so here we are. I want to make one thing very clear. The Monster Hunter High series is not strictly based on what monsters I like best. That's partially because one of my favorite monsters is Namielle, who is gorgeous and fantastic and currently well outside my ability to make successfully in a way that lives up to my personal expectations for my skills. No, this series is going to be based around monsters I feel I can come up with really strong designs for, and that may or may not line up with monsters I personally love. Such as our first candidate, who incidentally strikes me as a perfect subject to kick off this series with, since we are in that spookiest time of year. Meet the Blank Stare Wyvern, Khezu. Pretty creepy, huh? Yeah, I thought so too. Khezu is definitely not on my list of favorite monsters, but it does about top my list of creepiest monsters. It's a blind, cave-dwelling wyvern that uses its sense of smell to track prey and ambush it from above, using its acidic saliva and ability to generate huge bursts of electricity to defend itself from threats. The way it likes to stick to ceilings, stretch out its neck to snap at you from a surprising distance, and generate fields of electricity around itself and spit balls of lightning across the map can make it a challenge for novice hunters, and its transparent skin and lamprey-like mouth make it all but guaranteed to haunt the nightmares of veteran ones. On top of that, the armor and weapons you craft from it have this sort of creepy medical theme. So in honor of Halloween, let's kick off the Monster Hunter High series with Khezu. With this series, I'm doing some concept sketches for each monster. I had a really strong concept for Khezu, so she didn't go through too many iterations before I settled on this design. Because of the creepy medical theme of Khezu's gear, I took additional inspiration from one of the best-known creepy medical monsters in pop culture, the nurses from Silent Hill. Now, I'm not a horror person as a rule, and I've never played the Silent Hill games, but even I know that yikes, these ladies are really creepy, and perfectly suited as inspiration for this doll. So with that bit of nightmare fuel out of the way, let's get started. You know that Laguna Blue doll that kept getting hand transplants over the course of my last couple of videos? Well, it's finally her turn to get customized, and the squishy Howleen hands she wound up with last video are going to be perfect for what I have in mind. This custom is going to be an interesting one. I just hope I can still sleep after I get it finished. As always, we start with prepping the doll and stripping her to the basics. This Laguna is in pretty good shape, but she has some rather loose leg joints that I intend to turn to my advantage. The shoes she's wearing came from a Spectre doll, and I will be using them later on. They're just really tight, which is kind of annoying. Once she's naked, I cut off her hair because Laguna's long flowing locks are not appropriate for our creepy cave dweller. And now we're doing something a bit out of the ordinary. I'm cutting off her face. With an X-Acto knife, I carefully slice through the vinyl and cut her face off, leaving the neck hole intact. This will allow me to sculpt Khezu's gaping maw using the hollow head as a framework later on. Yeah, that's, weirder than usual for my customs. Monster High dolls always have these weirdly long neck pegs. I do not understand why. All I know is that this is going to get in the way later, so I trim down the top using some wire cutters. After a dunk in hot water to loosen the glue, I scrape out the hair plugs. It's a bit easier than usual since I can actually see what I'm doing this time. Now we've got that all cleaned out, I'm going to set the doll aside and work on the hands. As I mentioned, Laguna wound up with Howleen's squishy, flexed hands. This is perfect for what I have in mind. Khezu has the typical wyvern wing, with a couple of large claws at the wrist joint and several other fingers acting as the support for the wing, roughly based on the anatomy of a bat wing. I use some hot glue to glue the first and second fingers on each hand together, then the third and fourth fingers, so I wind up with a thumb and two fingers at the end. Next, I break out the Apoxie Sculpt. The first order of business is to make a solid surface to work on, using a bit of foil for support and to keep the epoxy from getting in and fouling up the neck peg. Then I lay a thin sheet of epoxy over the opening and form a smooth surface that will eventually become the roof and back of the mouth, as well as the inside of the lower jaw. At this point, I'm not going for detail, I'm just trying to make a support layer that will help keep the soft vinyl of the head from deforming under pressure and peeling away from the epoxy later on. Apoxie Sculpt takes a few hours to harden and about 24 hours to fully cure, so I move back to the hands and do a first pass there. Again, this underlayer is more about making a firm support for later sculpting and for keeping the squishy vinyl where I want it more than anything else. I happen to have a bit of mixed epoxy left over, so I lay it along the spine to start forming the ridge that Khezu has along its back. Khezu has this thin, transparent, and wrinkly skin, so ultimately the entire doll is going to get a layer of epoxy over it. This means I have to work in sections and layers so I don't damage my previous work. Layer 1 is cured, time for layer 2. This layer on the head and hands is about smoothing over layer 1, making sure the transition between epoxy and vinyl is secure and seamless, and starting to etch in some detail and texture. I also add a thin layer of epoxy over the neck and shoulders, using a fine-tipped sculpting tool to add the wrinkles. For layer 3, I add the gums, claws, and bring the sculpted skin down over the chest. Next, I add the tongue. It's a pretty large piece of the mouth, and I don't want to have to try and fit it in past the teeth later. Incidentally, once the tongue is cured enough to work around, that's exactly what I start adding. Khezu has these rows of teeth that are like something between a lamprey and a shark, and the gums I sculpted earlier make a perfect base to work on. This is definitely the point where this doll starts looking kind of nightmarish. With the teeth in place, I add the fleshy lips and begin sculpting the features of the head. It's pretty straightforward. Empty eye sockets, some nostrils, and wrinkly skin. You can see why I didn't bother removing the factory paint earlier. As an aside, Apoxie Sculpt does have resins and other chemicals in it that create the reactions that make it harden without needing to bake it. These chemicals can be a bit nasty and can irritate the skin if you're sensitive. You should probably be wearing gloves while you work with it, and if you're like me and hate trying to sculpt while wearing gloves, you should probably at least wear them while mixing the two parts together. Make sure to wash your hands thoroughly with soap and water after using Apoxie Sculpt. This was about the point where I ran out of my old batch of Apoxie Sculpt and had to open a new package. That's why the color suddenly changed. One of the things that makes Khezu so unnerving to fight is the battle music. When fighting large monsters in Monster Hunter, the monster will eventually spot you approaching and become alert, which triggers the start of its associated battle music. Some monsters share a theme track, while others have their own unique music. The thing is, Khezu is entirely blind. It can't see your hunter approaching, so it has no battle music. Khezu hunts take place in complete silence, broken only by the sound effects of combat, and this horrible hell noise. One of the two most terrifying monster roars in the series right there. Believe it or not, this is actually the bulk of the sculpting done. The rest is just adding on thin layers of sculpt on the body and adding the wrinkly details. I do this in stages, adding epoxy to small parts of the body and letting them cure before working on the next, so I don't accidentally squash my work. This actually winds up happening a bit anyway, but it's not too bad, and it's in a spot that kinda gets covered up later anyway. The only part that doesn't get covered in Epoxy Sculpt is the ankles and feet. Here I just make sure I have a nice smooth transition between the sculpt and the plastic and call it good. I don't want to add any bulk to the feet at all because the shoes I picked out are already a tight fit. And now we paint. Instead of starting with a stark white base, I take a page out of Diana from Middle Rabbit Dolls' book and start with this desaturated pale mauve shade. Technically, Khezu doesn't have white skin. It has translucent skin that shows the veins and organs underneath. Using a colored base under the other layers will give the skin that translucent look. The interior of the mouth gets painted in shades of red and pink with bright red for the lips. And then the teeth get painted bright white. With the base coat in place, I start blushing and adding undertones. I stick with darker, desaturated mauves and bluish purples to give her a sort of bruised look. When I said earlier that I was taking tips from Diana over at Middle Rabbit Dolls, what I really meant was I obsessively watched the blushing and undertone sections of her videos trying to figure out how she does what she does. She has an amazing grasp on this part of doll customizing, and her dolls always come out looking incredibly alive. She also gave me some advice on colors for my Khezu, so I just want to give her a shout out and a huge thank you. Go check out her channel because she does some awesome work. I make sure to seal Khezu thoroughly with Mr. Super Clear before moving on to the next step. As always, use great care and all of the appropriate safety gear when using MSE because it's some really nasty stuff. Next, it's time to add the veins that appear under Khezu's skin. I use my Artesia watercolor pencils to lay out the veins, sticking to desaturated blues and brighter reds. Khezu has these large bluish veins visible running along its flanks, which I make sure to recreate here running down her sides. In some Monster Hunter games, you can also sort of see Khezu's heart through its skin, so I add in a red blotch on her chest where it ought to be. Next is a pale gray layer of paint that I tried to make as translucent as I could so the veins remain visible through it. At this point you can still see them. I kind of feel like I should have stopped here when you can still really see the veins and all. Sadly, I did not. Instead, I continue merrily along, adding a dark wash to the body to pick out the details of the sculpt. Then I added a highlight layer of white, and that proved to be too much. You can barely see the veins or underlayers anymore, which is really disappointing. She also turned out way more purple than I originally wanted. I let that part sit for a while as I painted details for the mouth and teeth, and finally I decided I could live with a Khezu that looked more bruised and corpse-like instead of transparent and cave critter-y. After all, she's still very spooky. I did go back and reinforce the blushing with a very dilute glaze of a pinkish red, which helped. And while I'm at it, I sneak in a bit of interference red pigment over the heart and in the mouth to give them an unearthly sheen. To seal in the paint job, I use Liquitex Satin Varnish. This is a bit less glossy than the gloss version of the varnish, and I chose it because I want her to look a bit wet and slimy, like a cave worm or something. I use Liquitex Gloss Varnish on the mouth to make it look really wet. Then on a whim, I add more to pool in the lower jaw and around the bottom teeth, as well as adding drips on the lip and one of the upper fangs. After building up a few layers of this, it really looks like she has saliva dripping from her mouth. That's the doll herself done, now it's time for the outfit. I do all of my sewing off screen. I stitched up a tail with a wire armature and used some leftover fluff from making yarn wefts to stuff it. For the wings, I cut out and sewed together these sort of bat wing shaped pieces, then stitched some wire into place to form the phalanges of the wings. These were formed by bending a piece of wire in half with a loop at the top that fits over the wrist, and folding back the ends of the wire so they wouldn't poke through the fabric. Then I stitched a piece of ribbon to the top corners of the wings that will tie around the doll's neck. This design is based off the costume wings that belly dancers sometimes use in their performances, though the ones they use don't have the extra finger. I also stitch up a little nurse uniform off screen that I made using a basic Monster High mini dress as a base. I just needed to make it a little bigger to accommodate the sculpting on her body, add some pockets, a collar and sleeves, and ta-da! Instant nurse uniform. With the physical parts of the outfit made, I break out the paints once again. I use very diluted browns, grays, and pinks to age and grungify the dress, then add details like seams, buttons, and the red cross on the breast pocket. The tail and wings get treated with washes of paint in colors that mostly match the skin tones, and then I add in faded veins for detail. Next is the shoes. They get painted white with purplish gray details. Once the base coat is dry, I go back and add a wash of brownish gray to make them look dirty and to pick out the details in the sculpting. These were from a Spectre doll and feature these really nifty chains for the ankle straps that I thought were really cool and fitting for this project. Seal the shoes with some Liquitex satin varnish and they're done. Last thing to do is to add the tail. I previously used my new hand drill to make a hole at the base of the doll's spine. Now I use some E6000 glue to glue the tail in place, and that's it. She's ready for assembly. Let's get her dressed. Ooh, I really like her now that she's all assembled. She's really close to my concept art, and I think with the outfit on, the slightly off coloration actually works pretty well. Horror is something that's really outside my wheelhouse. It's definitely not my usual thing. Spooky? Sure, but something like this is not something I would normally make. There was just something about Khezu that caught my imagination and demanded that I make a doll in its honor. And really, there was something quite freeing about making a horror-themed doll. Outside of the technical aspects of trying to create a monster with partially translucent skin, there really wasn't any pressure to make this doll perfect. Normally, with a cute or pretty character, you have to be really careful. The face and features need to be symmetric. You need to be careful not to add details that make the character look wrong. The paint job and detailing needs to be really clean, etc., etc. With this, there was none of that. She could be messy and wrinkly and could have layers of detail that I might otherwise not have added. And she came out really cool. And okay, having all my friends look at my progress pictures and go, haha, thanks, I hate it, and oh gods, Kenna, why, just gave me life all through this project. Really, it was glorious. So in a weird way, I kinda really like this creepy doll. Thanks, Khezu. Please don't haunt my nightmares. That wraps up this first installment of my Monster Hunter High miniseries. I already have a bunch of other monsters lined up for the series, so stay tuned. Thank you for joining me for the creation of Khezu. Please leave a like and a comment because it really helps to grow the channel. As always, there's a link to my Instagram in the description along with a list of materials. Join me next time on SilverGryphon Makes a Thing, where we make whatever we feel like at the moment.